Kiddos, we're talking about General Sherman's march to the sea. Now, I want you to kind of look over here before we start, and Andy might especially because of being gone yesterday. What has happened is the Union has captured Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is right on the Georgia-Tennessee border. Sherman has been given control of the Western Theater forces, and he's basically going to make an assault upon the South through Georgia, up through South Carolina, up through North Carolina. And the goal is to make General Grant in Virginia, surround the Confederate capital, end the Civil War. So when we talk about General Sherman's march to the sea, we're talking about his march through Georgia and the Carolinas. Now, it was in September of 1864 that General William Sherman led his assault on Atlanta, Georgia. September 1864, General Sherman led his assault on Atlanta, Georgia. Now, he ordered two things as he reached Atlanta. He ordered the bombing of Atlanta, and he cut all railroad lines into the city. Why would he do that? Why would he cut all railroad lines into the city? So they couldn't get any supplies, any food, water, medicine, etc. So it's kind of like what they did at Vicksburg. So he orders the bombing of Atlanta, and he cuts off all railroad lines into the city. And this bombing continued for several weeks, and without food, water, and medicine, the people of Atlanta could not hold out any longer, and they surrendered. So this is very similar to Vicksburg, although the siege on Vicksburg was much longer. Anyway, they bombed Atlanta, cut the railroad ties. The bombing continued for several weeks, and without food, water, and medicine, the people of Atlanta simply could not hold out any longer and surrendered. Well, Sherman leaves Atlanta and continues towards the sea, and his plan is to have his Union troops live off the land and make Georgia howl. So Sherman's plan when he leaves Atlanta is the Union troops are going to march through Georgia, they're going to live off the land, and they're going to make Georgia howl. What does that mean, Charles? He's going to make, those troops are going to make Georgia howl. As they march from Atlanta through Georgia, they're going to live off the land, and they're going to make Georgia howl. What's that mean?
They're making known that they're there and that they're taking the land up?
Yep, absolutely. They want to make the people of the South suffer as much as possible and make them regret ever seceding from the Union. So Sherman's plan is to take his Union troops, march through Georgia, have his troops live off the land, and make Georgia howl. In other words, General Sherman wanted to make sure the people of the South suffered as much as possible for their decision to secede from the Union. Now, during General Sherman's march to the sea, his Union troops practiced what we called total war. As Sherman's Union troops march to the sea, they're going to practice what we call total war. And I'll give you 4 examples of that. So during General Sherman's march to the sea, the Union's going to practice total war. Number 1, they are going to seize or destroy anything along the way that might be a benefit to the Confederacy. They're either going to seize or destroy anything along the way that may benefit the Confederacy. They are going to seize or destroy anything along the way that may benefit the Confederacy. Number 2, they're going to destroy all railroad lines they come in contact with during their march to the sea. They're going to destroy all railroad lines they come in contact with during this march to the sea. Number 4, they're going to feed on rich farm products from southern farms. That's number 3. They're going to feed on all rich farm products from southern farms. They're going to feed on rich farm products from southern farms. And number 4, anything the Union did not want, they were simply going to destroy or throw away to rot. For example, any of that food they come across to a very rich dairy farm, for example, they'll eat what they want, destroy the rest, or leave it to rot. So when they practiced total war, they seized or destroyed anything along the way that may benefit the Confederacy. They destroyed all the Union destroyed all railroad lines. Union soldiers fed on rich farm products on southern farms, and anything the Union did not want, they simply destroyed or threw away to rot. So Sherman, at this time, kiddos, is marching to the sea through Georgia. He'll soon hit South Carolina, North Carolina, and end up in Virginia. Now, interestingly enough, we're going to have a presidential election in the middle of this whole thing. And that'll be the election of 1864. Now, Lily O'Callahan asked me an interesting question yesterday, and I'm seeing if anybody here is going to ask me that same question before we get started. The election of 1864. What might be a question you'd have going into that election? What?
Who's going to run for,
Why would you have an election?
What are the parties?
Okay, well, maybe why we got to have one every 4 years. Lincoln's up for re-election, or somebody else has got to take over.
What other parties are there?
Well, we'll have the same parties. Good question. But what might you be thinking?
So, how are they going to go about voting if the country's split?
Right. What's the voting going to be like? Right. We got a Confederate country or Confederate split, not a country yet. Very good question. Who's going to get a vote and who isn't? Right. And we'll answer that for you. Well, President Lincoln really thought that the fall of Atlanta, Georgia would help his cause for re-election in 1864. You got to be honest here. Do you think people are getting a little tired of Civil War?
Yeah.
And when you're the sitting president during the Civil War, it's sometimes difficult to get people's support because they're thinking, my God, when is this war going to end? And because General Sherman had captured Atlanta, Georgia, he thought that the people would think that the war was closing and it would help his support. We'll see if that's correct or not. So the Republican Party nominate President Lincoln for re-election, and they nominate Andrew Johnson as his vice presidential running mate. So Lincoln is nominated by the Republican Party for re-election to the presidency, and then they nominate Andrew Johnson as his vice presidential running mate. This is kind of an interesting story because Andrew Johnson was a former Democratic congressman from Tennessee. He was a former Democratic congressman from Tennessee. And obviously we can read the future that when Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, because we all know he was, right? You're going to have a Democrat taking over the country in what the Republicans consider the Republican administration. So that's going to cause some problems, which we'll talk about later. The Democratic Party, who they nominate for the president, you'll never guess. It's a familiar name we've talked about in the last 2 weeks. Who'd they nominate?
Lee.
Who?
Lee. Robert Lee.
No? You're kind of close. You're just a polar opposite. No, good guess. Keep going in that direction. So not Lee, because that would be the polar opposite, and not Meade. Who else might they have nominated? No. Think about Meade. What was Meade? A Union general. Who might have they nominated? No. George McClellan. So General George McClellan will be the Democratic nominee for president, and his running mate will be G.H. Pendleton. I don't have this on your sheet, but I want you to write it down. G.H. Pendleton. G.H. Pendleton, and he was from Ohio. So the Democratic Party nominates General George McClellan for president and G.H. Pendleton from Ohio for the vice presidency. This is kind of an interesting thing. Pendleton had served in both houses of Congress from Ohio, which means he was both a representative and a U.S. Senator, so he had good political experience. G.H. Pendleton was a former, he had served in both houses of Congress representing the state of Ohio. He also, think about this, was the son-in-law of a fellow by the name of Francis Scott Key, who did what? Wrote the Star Spangled Banner. So G.H. Pendleton was a former congressman and a former senator from Ohio. He was also the son-in-law of the famous Francis Scott Key. Now, what would the Democrats be campaigning on here, McKenna? What would they be going out saying? What would they be hoping there was? Think about it. What's Lincoln hoping to get support from? The victory in Atlanta, because people are what? A little bit tired of war. So they would be campaigning on an anti-war platform. If you elect Abraham Lincoln, you're just going to get more and more war. So they're hoping, the Democrats, that an anti-war feeling would help them win the presidency. The people that were sick of war would vote for them. The Republicans hope that General Sherman's capture of Atlanta had convinced voters that the Civil War was about over. Okay, that was kind of the goal of the whole thing. So the Democrats are hoping to get the anti-war sentiment, while Lincoln's hoping that that victory in Atlanta by General Sherman will make people think the war is over. Now, we'll answer Sully's question, because this is important. In this election, several states in the Confederacy did not participate in the election. Here are the states that did not vote in this election. Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas. So there were several Confederate states that did not vote. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas. Why did they not vote?
Because there are two deep south.
Because they were not being controlled by the federal government, right? They're seceded. So we have no control on it over them. Now keep that in mind. They didn't vote because the Union did not have any control of them.
But the ones who did were Tennessee.
Well, we're going to talk about that. How about Tennessee and Louisiana? They were Confederate states, but they are counted or controlled, excuse me, not counted, they're controlled by the Union, right? However, even though they voted, they did not count their votes in the election. So Tennessee and Louisiana voted. Tennessee and Louisiana voted because they were Confederate states controlled by the Union. But even though they voted, they decided not to count their votes in this election. Now, on the other hand, there were three states that voted for the first time in a presidential election. That would be Kansas, West Virginia, and Nevada, or Nevada. So 3 states would vote for the first time. They would send electors to the presidential election. That would be Kansas, West Virginia, and Nevada. So we have kind of a hodgepodge here. We have all the northern states that stayed loyal to the Union that vote. We've got Kansas, West Virginia, and Nevada that are loyal to the Union, who are going to be voting for the first time. But we have several states that aren't going to be voting because the Union doesn't control those states because they're part of the Confederacy. And you have 2 states that we control that are going to vote, but we didn't count them in the election. So we only had 25 electors. The number of states who participated in this election was 25. Okay? Now, this was a royal slaughter. as Lincoln received 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 12. 212 to 12. So Lincoln won an overwhelming victory in this election. Was there any Southerners running for any of the 4 positions of president or vice president? Only, where was Johnson from? Tennessee. So he was one of those states that what?
Wasn't counted.
They weren't counted, so he was the only one with the Southern thing in mind there. So anyway, Lincoln is re-elected in 1864 by a landslide. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is the Deep South falls to the Union. Okay, the Deep South falls to the Union. Okay, in December of 1864, General Sherman sends a telegraph to the newly re-elected President Lincoln. In December of 1864, General Sherman sends a telegraph to the newly re-elected President Lincoln. And in this telegraph, it states the following: I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah. So in December of 1864, General Sherman telegraphs the newly re-elected President Lincoln, and he states in his telegraph, quote, I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah. So what has he done?
Conquered another city.
He's captured the city of Savannah, Georgia. Okay, so he's making his continual trip through the South. So in December of 1864, General William Sherman telegraphs the newly re-elected President Lincoln and states, quote, I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah. So let's look at by January of 1865, this is where we're at. The Confederacy was all but defeated, and I'm going to give you 3 reasons why. By January of 1865, the Confederacy is all but defeated. It's all over but the shout for the most part. First example of that is Atlanta and Savannah, 2 very key important cities in the South, had fallen to the Union. Atlanta and Savannah, 2 very key cities in the South, had both fallen to the Union. What's that?
2 ends or 1 end?
Savannah has 2 ends and an A and an H. Number 2, the Deep South had been penetrated by Union forces and basically swept clean. Sherman had practiced total war all through the South and pretty much swept the South clean. And the 3rd reason, by January of 1865, that the Confederacy was all but defeated is the government was bankrupt. The government was bankrupt. The Confederate government was bankrupt.
That's by January of 1865?
By the 1st of January of 1865, the Confederacy was all defeated, all but defeated. Why? Number 1, Atlanta and Savannah had fallen to the Union. Number 2, the Deep South had been penetrated by Union forces and swept clean. And number 3, the Confederate government was bankrupt. Now, even though the prospects were so bleak, Confederate President Jefferson Davis told his rebel soldiers to fight on until they could fight no more. So even though things looked pretty darn bleak for the South, Confederate President Jefferson Davis told his men to fight on until they could fight no more. Now, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is the surrender of both Petersburg and Richmond. Both of those cities located where? In Virginia. The surrender of both Petersburg and Richmond. Now, you don't have to write this down, but just think about it. As Union General Sherman's marching closer and closer to Richmond from the south, Confederate General Lee's troops were getting thinner and thinner, right? I told you the population cycle's making a difference. And even though Grant's taken tremendous losses in Virginia, the Confederate troops are taking losses, and every man lost is an issue. Well, another Union general by the name of Philip Sheridan and his army were closing in on Richmond from the north as Sherman was approaching from the south.
He's Union or?
He's Union, yeah. So Union General Philip Sheridan, and you'll hear a lot more about him when we get into the Indian Wars. Union General Philip Sheridan and his army were closing in on Richmond from the north. William T. Sherman and his Union army were approaching Richmond from the south. General Lee has got his forces stationed at Petersburg, Virginia. General Lee has his Confederate forces stationed at Petersburg, Virginia. Low on food and soldiers, General Lee is forced to abandon Petersburg in early April of 1865. Low on food and soldiers, General Lee was forced to abandon Petersburg in early April of 1865. Just a few days later, Lee marches his men to Richmond and eventually surrenders Richmond as well. So after surrendering Petersburg in April of 1865, Lee marches to Richmond, and a few days later, Lee is forced to surrender Richmond as well. Before they abandon Richmond, Lee orders his soldiers to set fire to